The stars had always been a promise. For thousands of years, humans looked up at the night sky and dreamed of the day they would travel among those distant lights. When that day finally came, humanity expected wonder. They expected friendship. They expected to join a great family of intelligent beings spread across the galaxy. What they found instead was cold indifference. The Galactic Collective was old. 12 spacefaring civilizations had built an empire that stretched across 100,000 star systems. They had cities made of living crystal. They had ships that could fold space like paper. They had knowledge gathered over millions of years. And they had rules. Doyen Park stood on the observation deck of Earth's first interstellar station, watching the alien fleet hang motionless in the black void. He was 53 years old, with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. As commander of Earth's United Defense Force, he had spent his whole life preparing humanity for contact with other species. He had not prepared for this. "They want us to evacuate," said Yuna Kim, his young aide. She held a data tablet in shaking hands. "One ship. They are giving us one ship." Do-hyun did not turn from the window. "One ship for 8 billion people." "Yes, sir." The alien vessels were beautiful in a terrible way. Long and silver, they moved without engines that humans could understand. There were 10,000 of them out there. 10,000 ships that could have stayed to help. 10,000 ships that were about to leave. "Show me the transmission again," Do-hyun said. Yuna pressed a button, and a hologram appeared in the air. The Netheran ambassador materialized before them. She was not human, not even close. Her body was made of pure light, shifting and flowing like a living aurora. When she spoke, her voice was musical, but empty of warmth. "People of Earth," the recording said, "the High Council has made its decision. The Void Swarm approaches your system. Our projections show it will arrive in 7 of your months. The swarm cannot be stopped. It cannot be reasoned with. It consumes all biological life it encounters." Do-hyun watched the alien's form flicker with colors he had no names for. "We have studied your species," the ambassador continued. "You are brave. You are creative. But you are young. Your technology is primitive. You have no experience with threats of this magnitude. The collective must preserve its resources for the greater survival of galactic civilization." The hologram paused, and for a moment, Do-hyun thought he saw something like regret in those patterns of light. "We offer you one transport vessel. It can carry 10,000 of your people to safety in collective space. We recommend you select your best scientists, your healthiest breeding pairs, your most valuable genetic samples. This is our gift to you. This is all we can do." The recording ended. Yuna was crying silently. She was only 25. She had joined the defense force full of hope and excitement about humanity's future among the stars. Now she understood what that future really meant. 10,000, she whispered. "How do we choose 10,000 people?" Do-hyun finally turned from the window. His face was stone, but his eyes burned with something that Yuna had never seen before. It was not fear. It was not despair, it was rage. "We do not choose," he said quietly. "Sir? We do not run. We do not abandon our people." Do-hyun walked to the communication console. "Get me a direct channel to the Netheran flagship." "Commander, they said the decision is final." "They said. I know what they said. Get me the channel." 5 minutes later, Do-hyun stood before a live holographic link to the collective's High Council. 12 alien representatives floated in the air around him, each one stranger than the last. There were beings of crystal, beings of gas, beings that existed in multiple dimensions at once. They had governed the galaxy for longer than humans had existed. They all looked at him like he was an insect. "Commander Park," the Netheran ambassador said, "we have already explained our position. Your request for additional support has been denied. I'm not requesting support, Do-hyun said. I'm giving you a warning. The aliens exchanged confused glances. A creature made of floating geometric shapes spoke in a voice like grinding stones. A warning? You threaten the collective? No. I am warning you about what you are creating. Do-hyun stepped forward, his voice steady and clear. Right now, humanity loves the stars. We came to you with open hands. We wanted to learn from you, to grow alongside you, to be your friends. He let the words hang in the air. But you are teaching us a different lesson. You are teaching us that we are alone. You are teaching us that when darkness comes, no one will help us. You are teaching us that the galaxy sees us as nothing. The ambassador's light flickered with something that might have been discomfort. We see you as unfortunate casualties of. You see us as expendable, Do-hyun interrupted. And you may be right. We may die. The swarm may consume our world and everything we have ever built. He smiled then, and it was not a kind smile. But if we survive, when we survive, we will remember this day. We will remember that the great galactic collective looked at 8 billion people and decided they were not worth saving. We will remember that you ran away. The council was silent. And one day, Do-hyun finished, you will remember too. He cut the transmission. Yuna stared at him with wide eyes. Sir, what do we do now? Do-hyun walked back to the window. In the distance, the collective fleet was already beginning to move, their great engines glowing as they prepared to far side of the galaxy. Now, Do-hyun said, now we fight. The Void Swarm came 7 months later, exactly as the collective had predicted. That it did not come as an army. It came as a storm. Billions of creatures poured out of dark space, each one a nightmare of metal and flesh twisted together. They had no eyes, but they could see. They had no mouths, but they could consume. They moved as one mind, one hunger, one endless purpose. They wanted to eat everything alive. The first cities fell in hours. Seoul, Tokyo, Beijing, Mumbai, great metropolises that had stood for centuries, became graveyards in a single night. The swarm did not negotiate. It did not slow down. It simply kept coming, wave after wave, like an ocean made of claws and teeth. Humanity's military fought with everything they had. Jets screamed through burning skies. Tanks rolled through streets filled with bodies. Soldiers fired until their weapons melted in their hands. None of it was enough. By the end of the first year, 3 billion people were dead. Taeyun Choi was a farmer's son from a small village in the south. When the swarm came, he was 20 years old, with strong hands and a simple dream of growing rice like his father and grandfather before him. That dream died with his family on the 3rd day of the invasion. He found himself holding a shovel, standing over the body of a swarm creature he had beaten to death. His hands were covered in black blood. His heart was cold and empty. And he realized something important. He was not afraid anymore. Fear was a luxury for people who had something to lose. Taeyeon joined the resistance. He fought with farmers and teachers and shopkeepers, ordinary people who picked up whatever weapons they could find. He learned quickly. He learned that the swarm creatures communicated through high-pitched sounds that human ears could barely hear. He learned that they were weak to certain frequencies, that loud noises could confuse them for precious seconds. He learned that humanity was not helpless. 5 years into the war, Taeyeon had become a general. Not because anyone appointed him, but because people followed him. He had a gift for seeing patterns in chaos, for finding hope in darkness. Where other commanders saw only death, he saw opportunities. They think we are animals, he told his soldiers before a battle that everyone said they would lose. They think we will lie down and die. But we are not animals. We are humans. We have been surviving for 1 million years. Ice ages, plagues, wars, disasters. We survived because we refused to quit. They won that battle. And the next. And the next. Eunji Kang was a schoolteacher before the swarm came. She taught children to read and write, to add and subtract, to dream about their futures. When her school was destroyed and her students were killed, something inside her broke. But in the breaking, something else was born. She became the voice of the civilian resistance. While soldiers fought on the front lines, Eunji organized the survivors behind them. She set up hidden farms in underground bunkers. She created networks of messengers who ran through enemy territory. She taught people how to make weapons from scrap metal and chemicals found in cleaning supplies. "We are not just fighting to survive," she said in radio broadcasts that reached millions of desperate ears. "We are fighting for every child who will never go to school again. We are fighting for every song that will never be sung. We are fighting for tomorrow." Her words gave people strength when they had none left. In the 40th year of the war, the tide began to turn. Dr. Ji-won Lee had spent decades studying the swarm in her underground laboratory in Bizen. She barely slept. She barely ate. She worked with hands that shook from exhaustion, driven by a fury that never dimmed. Her husband had died in the first wave. Her daughter had died in the 10th year. Everyone she had ever loved was gone, but her mind remained, and it was a powerful weapon. "I found it," she said one morning, her voice barely a whisper. Her assistants gathered around as she held up a small device, no bigger than a radio. The swarm shares one mind. They communicate constantly, coordinating their attacks. But the signal has a weakness. She pressed a button. A high-pitched tone filled the laboratory, painful to human ears, but bearable. This frequency disrupts their connection. It breaks them apart. The first sonic disruptors were crude and unreliable. They burned out after a few uses. They only worked at close range. But they worked. For the first time in 40 years, humans had a weapon that the swarm feared. Taehan lost his left arm in the Battle of Manila. A swarm creature had torn it off at the elbow, and he had killed the creature with his remaining hand before collapsing from blood loss. When he woke up in a field hospital, Eunji was sitting beside him. "We thought you were dead," she said. Taeyeon looked at the bandaged stump where his arm used to be. Then he looked at the pile of swarm corpses that his soldiers had brought back as trophies. "I need a new arm," he said. "Make me one from that." They did. Engineers built him a prosthetic limb from swarm chitin and human technology. It was ugly and heavy and hurt to use. But every time Taeyeon looked at it, he remembered what he was fighting against. And what he was fighting for. The war lasted 63 years in total. When Taeyeon, now an old man with white hair and scars covering every inch of his body, led the final assault on the last swarm hive. Fewer than 2 billion humans remained on Earth. Cities were rubble. Oceans were poison. The sky was gray with ash. But they had one. Taeyeon stood on the shore as the last hive collapsed into the Pacific Ocean, its massive form sinking beneath the waves. Eunji stood beside him, frail and ancient now, leaning on a cane made from the leg of a creature they had killed together decades ago. "What now?" she asked. Taeyeon watched the waters calm. Somewhere up there, beyond the ash clouds, the stars still shone. The same stars where the collective had fled to hide. "Now we remember," he said. "And now we prepare." He did not say for what. He did not need to. They both knew. The Galactic Collective believed Earth was dead. Their long-range sensors showed a ruined planet. Continents scarred by decades of war. Oceans dark with pollution. Atmosphere thick with ash and smoke. And everywhere, the biosignatures of swarm infestation, slowly fading as the parasites consumed the last scraps of life. The collective recorded humanity in their archives as species 7,291, extinct. They held a brief ceremony, spoke some formal words about tragedy and sacrifice, and then moved on with their lives. They did not look closer. They did not send ships to confirm. They simply assumed that primitive humans had died the way primitive species always died when faced with the void swarm. This was their first mistake. Beneath the scars of Earth's surface, humanity was not just surviving. Humanity was transforming. Minho Beek was born 30 years after the war ended. He never knew the sky without ash clouds. He never tasted food that did not come from underground farms. He grew up in tunnels and bunkers, surrounded by machines built from swarm technology and human desperation. But he also grew up with stories. His grandmother, who had fought beside General Tayan himself, told him about the days before the swarm. She told him about cities that touched the clouds, about oceans blue and clean, about a night sky filled with stars instead of smoke. And she told him about the aliens who had abandoned humanity to die. Never forget, she said to him when he was just a child. Never forgive. Minho did not forget. Instead, he learned. He became an engineer, and then a scientist, and then something more. The swarm had used technology that no human fully understood, machines that grew like living things, metals that healed themselves, weapons that drew power from dimensions humanity could not even name. Minho spent 40 years taking that technology apart and putting it back together. The swarm was not evil, he wrote in his journals, which would later become required reading for every human scientist. Evil requires choice. The swarm was simply hunger, pure and perfect. But their technology was something else. It was advanced beyond anything the collective possesses. And now it belongs to us. Human ships had once been slow and clumsy, barely able to reach neighboring stars. Within 3 decades of Minho's work, humanity had developed drives that could cross the galaxy in weeks. Within 5 decades, they had improved upon those drives until they were faster than anything the collective had ever built. They did all of this in secret. Admiral Sujin Han commanded the construction of humanity's new fleet. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a sharper mind. Her grandfather had been a soldier who died in the first year of the war. Her mother had been a resistance fighter who died in the last year. Sujin herself had been born in a bunker, raised on recycled air and synthetic food, and trained from childhood for a single purpose. "We are building more than ships," she told her officers during the construction of the first battle cruiser. "We are building a message. We are building an answer to the question the collective asked 300 years ago." "What question?" asked a young officer. Sujin looked out the viewport at the massive skeleton of steel and swarm chitin taking shape in the asteroid shipyard. They asked if humanity was worth saving. "For 63 years, we gave them our answer in blood and fire. Now we will give them another answer." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We will show them what they threw away." The fleet grew in the shadows of Earth's solar system. Shipyards hidden in asteroid fields. Training facilities carved into dead moons. Research stations disguised as debris from the war. The collective sensors, if they had bothered to look, would have seen nothing but ruins. They did not look. They had already written humanity off. While the military prepared in secret, Earth's surface slowly healed. Scientists learned to use swarm biotechnology for good instead of destruction. They created plants that could clean poisoned soil. They engineered fish that could purify toxic water. They built machines that pulled carbon from the atmosphere and turned it into building materials. It took generations, but the sky began to clear. The oceans began to turn blue again. Forests grew where cities had once burned, and in those forests, children played who had never known war. They learned about the long night in school, the way children in safer times had learned about ancient history. They knew the names of heroes like Taiyuan and Yunji, like Ji-won and Do-yun. They knew that humanity had faced extinction and refused to die. But they also knew that the story was not over. Why do we keep building warships? A young girl asked her teacher one day. The swarm is gone. The war is over. Why do we need to fight? The teacher, an old woman who had survived the war herself, smiled gently. Because the swarm was not our only enemy, child. And because sometimes the ones who should have been our friends teach us the cruelest lessons of all. The girl did not understand. She was too young. But one day, she would. 100 years after the war ended, humanity was ready. They had 10,000 warships, each one more powerful than anything the collective had ever fielded. They had weapons that could crack planets and shields that could withstand stars. They had soldiers trained in every form of combat, hardened by generations of living on the edge of extinction. But more than that, they had purpose. Admiral Sujin Han had died decades ago. But her successor, Admiral Hyun-Soo Shin, carried her vision forward. He was an old man now, one of the last who had been alive. During the final years of the long night, he remembered the taste of ash and the sound of swarm creatures screaming in the dark, and he remembered his father's stories about the day the collective abandoned Earth. They thought we would die quietly, Hyun-Soo said to his command staff on the bridge of the unyielding dawn. They thought we would disappear, and they would never have to think about us again. He looked out at the fleet assembled around them. 12,000 ships, crewed by soldiers who knew their history, who knew what had been done to their ancestors, who knew that somewhere out there, the species that had left them to die still lived in comfort and safety. They were wrong, Hyun-Soo said. And soon, they will know exactly how wrong they were. The fleet waited in the darkness, patient and silent. They would not have to wait much longer. Nathara Prime was the jewel of the galaxy. Its cities floated on clouds of pure energy. Its towers reached so high they touched the edge of space. Its people, beings of living light, had built a civilization of beauty and wonder that had lasted for 10 million years. On the day the Void Swarm returned, all of that began to die. The swarm had been sleeping. Deep beneath Nathara Prime's crystal surface, in caves that predated the Netheran civilization itself, a hive had waited. Perhaps it had been there since the swarm's first invasion, forgotten and dormant. Perhaps it had always been part of a larger plan. It did not matter. What mattered was that it woke up hungry. The first attacks came at dawn. Creatures burst from the ground in the heart of the capital city, tearing through streets filled with Netheran citizens who had never known war. The beings of light screamed as they were consumed, their energy drained, their forms extinguished like candles in a storm. By noon, 3 cities had fallen. By nightfall, the Netheran government had collapsed into chaos. We need help, the new ambassador pleaded into every communication channel. Her light flickered with terror, unstable and dim. Please, anyone. The swarm is here. It came from beneath us. We cannot stop it. We cannot. Her transmission cut off as her city was overrun. Across the collective's territory, panic spread faster than the swarm itself. The great fleet that had once numbered 10,000 ships had grown soft over 3 centuries of peace. Ships that should have been ready for combat sat in dock, their crews untrained, their weapons untested. By the time they began to mobilize, it was already too late. The swarm spread from Nathara Prime to neighboring systems, carried by ships that refugees had used to flee. It infected colony worlds, research stations, trade hubs. It moved through the collective like fire through dry grass, consuming everything in its path. For the first time in 10 million years, the masters of the galaxy knew what it felt like to be prey. On the bridge of the unyielding dawn, Admiral Hyun-Soo Shin received the distress signals. He stood motionless as transmission after transmission played across the screens. Alien voices begged for salvation. Alien cities burned. Alien worlds died. It was strange, he thought, how familiar it all sounded. "Admiral," said Jian, his tactical officer. She was young, barely 30, born long after the long night had ended. But she knew her history. She knew what the collective had done. "They are calling for any available ships. They are calling for help." Hyunsu did not respond immediately. He walked to the viewport and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, his ancestors had burned. His grandfather had died fighting swarm creatures in the streets of a city that no longer existed. His grandmother had starved in a bunker, keeping her children alive on rats and rainwater. His parents had grown up in a world of ash and horror, never knowing if they would survive to see tomorrow. And the collective had watched from safety. The collective had run away. The collective had decided that 8 billion human lives were not worth the trouble of saving. Now they were dying, and they were asking for help. "Sir," Jian said again, her voice uncertain. "What are your orders?" Hyunsu thought about revenge. He thought about justice. He thought about watching the collective burn the way humanity had burned. Alone and abandoned, screaming into an uncaring void. It would be so easy. All he had to do was nothing. But then he thought about something else. He thought about what kind of species humanity had become. He thought about the lessons of the long night, not the lessons of hatred, but the lessons of survival. The lessons of strength. The lessons of choosing who you want to be, no matter what has been done to you. He thought about Yoonji Kang's voice on those old radio broadcasts, speaking to millions of desperate people. "We are not just fighting to survive. We are fighting for tomorrow." What kind of tomorrow did he want? "Set course for Nethera Prime," Hyunsu said. "All ships." The bridge fell silent. Every officer stared at him. "Sir?" Jian's voice cracked with disbelief. "They left us to die. They watched us burn and did nothing. And you want us to save them?" Hyunsu turned to face his crew. These were soldiers who had trained their whole lives for this moment. They had memorized the history of the abandonment. They had sworn oaths to never forget what had been done. Many of them had expected this day to be about vengeance. "Listen to me," Hyunsu said, his voice calm and steady. 300 years ago, the collective made a choice. They chose fear. They chose selfishness. They chose to let innocent people die because it was easier than fighting for them. He walked among his officers, meeting their eyes one by one. That choice defined them. It showed the galaxy what they truly were. And now we have a choice of our own. We can be like them. We can let fear and anger and old wounds guide our actions. We can watch them die and feel satisfied that justice has been served. He stopped in the center of the bridge. Or we can be something else. We can show them, we can show the entire galaxy, that humanity is not what they thought we were. We are not primitive. We are not expendable. We are not defined by what was done to us. His voice rose, filling the bridge with its power. We are defined by what we do, by the choices we make when the universe is watching. And I choose to save them, not because they deserve it, not because I have forgiven them, but because I will not let their cowardice turn us into cowards. I will not let their cruelty make us cruel. The silence stretched for a long moment. Then Jian straightened her shoulders and turned to her console. "Course laid in for Nethera Prime, Admiral. All ships responding. We will arrive in 6 hours." Around the bridge, officers returned to their stations. The engines of 12,000 warships came to life. Humanity was going back to the stars. And this time, they were not alone. The human fleet emerged from fold space like a wall of steel and fire. 12,000 warships materialized above Nethera Prime in perfect formation. They were not beautiful like the collective's vessels. They were not elegant or graceful. They were brutal machines built for one purpose: war. Their hulls were dark metal and swarm chitin, scarred and ugly, but terrifyingly powerful. The collective survivors who still had working sensors looked up at their screens and could not believe what they were seeing. "Humans," whispered a Netheran officer on one of the few remaining defense platforms. "The humans are here. But that is impossible. They died 300 years ago." She was not the only one who thought so. Across the ruined system, collective survivors stared at the newcomers with a mixture of shock and horror. Humanity was supposed to be extinct. Humanity was supposed to be a footnote in galactic history. Humanity was not supposed to have a fleet larger and more powerful than anything the collective had ever built. But there they were, and they were not running. Admiral Hyunsu Shin opened a channel that broadcast to every surviving collective vessel and platform. His face appeared on screens throughout the system, an old human man with gray hair and calm eyes, standing on the bridge of a ship that dwarfed their greatest battlecruisers. "This is Admiral Hyunsu Shin of the Human Defense Force," he said. "We have come to help. All collective vessels, fall back behind our lines. All civilian ships, proceed to the following coordinates for evacuation. All military personnel, coordinate with our tactical frequency." He paused, and for just a moment, the ghost of his smile crossed his face. "Try to stay out of our way." The Battle of Nethar Prime lasted 11 days. Human ships cut through the swarm with weapons the collective had never imagined. Sonic disruptors, refined over 3 centuries, shattered swarm coordination in massive waves. Plasma cannons, powered by engines that bent the laws of physics, carved burning paths through enemy formations. Human soldiers, armored in suits made from swarm chitin and human engineering, landed on infested worlds and fought the creatures hand to hand. They were not gentle. They were not careful. They were efficient. The swarm had terrorized humanity for 63 years. Humans had spent every moment since then learning how to destroy it. Every tactic, every weapon, every strategy had been developed with one goal in mind: never again. And now that knowledge was unleashed. Sergeant Junho Park was 25 years old, born on an Earth that had finally begun to heal. He had grown up hearing stories about his ancestor, Commander Do-Yoon Park, who had stood before the collective council and warned them of their mistake. He had trained his whole life for the chance to prove those words true. Now he fought on the surface of Nethar Prime itself, leading his squad through streets filled with swarm creatures and collective refugees. The beings of light flickered and dimmed around him, too weak to fight, too terrified to run. His soldiers protected them anyway, forming walls of human bodies between the aliens and the monsters. "Keep moving," Junho shouted to a group of Netheran children, their small forms barely visible against the darkness. "Stay behind us. We will get you out." A swarm creature lunged from the shadows. Junho shot it without looking, his reflexes honed by years of training. Another creature came, and another. He killed them all. Behind him, the Netheran children clung to each other and watched the human soldier with something they had never felt before. Hope. When the last swarm hive finally collapsed, Junho was the one who planted humanity's flag in the ashes. It was a simple flag, blue and white, with a single symbol in the center: Earth, as it had looked before the long night, whole and beautiful and alive. He stood over the ruins and thought about everything his ancestors had sacrificed to bring him to this moment. 3 days later, the surviving leaders of the Galactic Collective gathered in what remained of their great hall. 12 representatives from 12 species, reduced now to a handful of frightened refugees. They waited in silence as Admiral Hyunsu Shin walked through the broken doors, his officers at his back. The Netheran ambassador, a young being of light who had inherited her position when her predecessor died in the first attack, stepped forward. Her form flickered with shame and fear. "You came," she said, her voice trembling. "After everything we did. After we left your people to die. You came to save us." Hyunsu stopped before her. He was tired. The battle had cost him 3,000 ships and 2 million soldiers, human lives spent to protect the same species that had abandoned them 3 centuries ago. The weight of that sacrifice pressed down on his shoulders, but he stood tall anyway. "You made a calculation," he said quietly. "When the swarm came for us, you decided we were not worth saving. You looked at 8 billion people, children, families, entire civilizations, and you decided that our lives meant less than your convenience." The ambassador's light dimmed with sorrow. She had no defense. There was none to give. "You may have been right," Hyunsu continued. "By your standards, we were weak. We were primitive. We had nothing to offer you. From a purely logical standpoint, abandoning us made perfect sense." He gestured toward the viewport, where human ships still maintained orbit. Medical teams were treating wounded aliens. Engineers were assessing damaged infrastructure. Soldiers were distributing food and supplies to refugees who had lost everything. But logic is not everything. Calculation is not everything. What you forgot, what you could not understand, is that weakness is not permanent. That suffering can build strength instead of breaking it. That the species you threw away would become something you could never have imagined. The ambassador looked up at him, her form flickering with confusion. "Then why did you save us? If you remember our betrayal, if you have not forgiven, why did you come?" Hyunsu was quiet for a long moment. He thought about his grandfather, who had died fighting. He thought about his grandmother, who had survived. He thought about 300 years of suffering and struggle and determination. And he thought about choice. "Because we are not like you," he said finally. "We do not abandon people in their darkest hour. We do not run from fights that matter. And we do not become the thing that hurt us, no matter how much we might want to." He turned to leave, then paused. "Humanity does not forget. We never will. But we also refuse to let our history define our future. The galaxy needs guardians. Not rulers. Not conquerors. Guardians. And if no one else will step up, then we will." He walked toward the exit, his officers following. "Wait," the ambassador called out. "What happens now? What do you want from us?" Hyunsu stopped at the door and looked back one final time. "We want you to do better," he said. "We want you to remember this moment, not as a debt you owe us, but as a lesson about what really matters. We want you to look at your own history and understand why it failed. And we want you to build something better, something worthy of the galaxy." He smiled, and for the first time, there was warmth in it. "That is what we want. That is why we came." Then he walked out, leaving the collective survivors in silence. Outside, the stars shone bright and clear. The ash clouds that had covered Earth for so long were finally gone. Somewhere across the galaxy, human children were playing in forests that had grown from the ashes of war. They were learning history. They were dreaming of the future, and above them, watching over them, 12,000 ships stood guard. Humanity had not forgotten the betrayal. They never would, but they had chosen something more important than revenge. They had chosen to be the species they wished the collective had been brave, compassionate, and unwilling to abandon the innocent, no matter the cost. The galaxy would remember this day, not as the day humanity took vengeance, but as the day they proved what they truly were, and that was a lesson the stars would never forget.